What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So it has been over 30 years now since the Montreal Canadiens won the Stanley Cup back in 1993. And since then, obviously, no Canadian team has won the Stanley Cup. Every single one besides the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Winnipeg Jets have made a Stanley Cup final, but nobody from Canada north of the border has won a Stanley Cup since. Obviously, you got your conspiracies that Gary Bettman got into office, 1993. Since then, they haven't. I don't believe any of that. But I think when looking at this season, I think they have a decent chance to get a Canadian Cup champ this season. When looking at it, four different teams that are safely in the playoffs, although I wouldn't say any of them are like the odds-on favorite to win it for the most part, but they have four pretty safe playoff teams that are in divisional spots right now. Some of them are going to have home ice in the first round. Some of them are probably going to win their first round matchup at the bare minimum. So I wanted to go through these four and start off with the least likely to win the Stanley Cup and work our way up. I'm going to give you a percentage chance based on the team, the history, the matchups that they're going to have in the first, second round. How easy is their path to a potential Stanley Cup? So without further ado, let's get into it. And first up, I don't mean to be a hater. I think this would kind of be the pick for most people, maybe the team that I have at number 3. But I think the Leafs are the least likely to win the Stanley Cup this season. I have them at 4%, so they still have a chance. It wouldn't shock me, a 1 out of 25 chance, but I do think that they are a pretty heavy underdog when looking at their team this year. It just doesn't inspire a ton of confidence in them, especially after Brad Living basically did nothing at the trade deadline besides trade for 2 heavy-set defensive defensemen for the most part. And when you look at that defense core, it's been pretty bad this season. One of the worst defensive cores in recent memory for the Toronto Maple Leafs. They've allowed the third most high danger chances in the entire NHL this season. Only the San Jose Sharks and the Columbus Blue Jackets have allowed more. The Chicago Blackhawks have allowed less high danger chances than the Toronto Maple Leafs. And when looking at it, you look at what Cup champs usually bring. They usually have a legit number 1 defenseman. I think Morgan Riley's a low-end number 1 defenseman overall in the league. I don't think that he's a contending level 2-way fantastic number 1 defenseman, as well as with Brody falling off, Giordano, they also don't really have a number 2, and just overall the drop-off from Morgan Riley is pretty decent. And again, I don't think Morgan Riley's like a franchise number 1 defenseman. So when looking at it, I'm just not that impressed with this team this season. When looking at also the goaltending, you look at the defense is weak as well as the goaltending. Samsonov's been playing a lot better, especially of late. Don't get me wrong, ever since he had that mental reset, got sent down to the AHL, never really played in the AHL, but got his mind right. He's been better, but I still think Samsonov's a bottom 5 goaltender in terms of the playoff teams, maybe even bottom 3 starting goalie of the 16 teams that are going to end up making the playoffs. So bad defense, questionable, inconsistent goaltender with a backup, and Joseph Woll, who's not playing very good right now. So if Samsonov struggles, they don't really have a guy they can turn to in a Joseph Woll. So I'm just very disappointed. I think, I'm not disappointed, but I'm very low on the Leafs' chances when coming into the season. I thought they would be more of a competitive team. I didn't expect them to for me to be this low heading into the playoffs. The forward core is obviously great. They have a very, very good top 6, top 9. Maybe they can outscore their problems if their top guys show up. I wouldn't be shocked if they obviously win in the first round against the Florida Panthers, even beat Boston in the second round, although Boston dogged them twice in March, as well as 2 other wins. They're 0-4 against Boston. So in looking at it, I just don't see it happening this season. But again, still a healthy 4%. I'm not saying it'd be the greatest upset. I'd be flabbergasted if they ended up winning the Stanley Cup. Just very low on them, unless Austin Matthews just takes over, Mitch Marner takes over, William Nylander actually usually plays good in the playoffs, but when looking at it, unless that happens, and that really hasn't happened in terms of long playoff success, I can't be too confident in the Toronto Maple Leafs. Next up, Winnipeg Jets. I have them at a solid 6%. I think that's about fair, but when looking at them, if they weren't in, they'd be maybe 7-8%. If they weren't right now going to face off against the Colorado Avalanche in the first round, not have home ice, then if they win that, they get the goddamn Dallas Stars, the division-winning Dallas Stars right now in the second round. They have by far the hardest first and second round matchups out of any team in a divisional spot right now. It's just very tough. So yes, they have an advantage in goal over the Colorado Avalanche and the Dallas Stars, but I think they both, Colorado and Dallas, have far deeper forward cores, far better defense cores. When talking about a number 1 defenseman, I think they have that number 1 defenseman in Josh Morrissey. Do they have that number 2 guy that can play big minutes that you usually see with the Stanley Cup winning team? I'm not so sure of that. You look at Cale Makar, Devon Tays last year, Pietrangelo Theodore. I don't think they had that 1-2 pair. And their special teams do scare me to a degree. When looking at their special teams, it's the 7th worst in the entire NHL this season at 76.4%, as well as the power play being 11th worst in the NHL at 18.8%. In the last month, since they got Tyler Toffoli, basically, it's still been around 18%. So special teams are pretty below average. Can they go on a run because Connor Hellebuck is that good? Definitely. That definitely could happen. He's the best goalie in the entire NHL right now. So that can happen. But would I bet on the Winnipeg Jets going deep, beating a Dallas, beating a Colorado right now? I just wouldn't. Been beating both of those in succession and then have to meet up another team in the goddamn Western Conference Finals. They just have such a hard path. I don't think it's their year, although they definitely are in that second tier of contenders. There's definitely like a 4 or 5 teams in the top tier. Then the Winnipeg Jets. I don't even know if the Leafs are in that one, but then it's after that. They're still a solid team, but only 6%. Next up, the Vancouver Canucks. Vancouver Canucks, I have it a healthy 8%. So around the 1-in-12 chance for the Vancouver Canucks to win the Stanley Cup. They did have a bit of their PDO regression that we talked about for so much. They started out 34-11-5. Since then, they've been 13-11-3. And don't get me wrong, I know Demko's been out, but that's also a part why I'm not that high on them. So when looking at it, they actually do have that number 1 and number 2 defenseman that I talked about before with Quinn Hughes, with Philip Hronik. When looking at Hronik, he actually needs to play better considering what he's done in the second half. First half, 36 points in 42 games. Yeah, I think the Canucks are a very deep team, but when looking at it, I don't have that much confidence in kind of their first actual playoff run. I know they had 2020, but that was the bubble. Obviously, that was different with the play-in, with the goddamn first round to no fans. I think their first, usually see with teams that make the playoffs for kind of like the first time or the first time in 3 to 4 years, they usually don't go on deep runs. Usually they get their toes wet with playoff experience. I think they're probably going to win a round, especially if they are the first seed in the Pacific. But I think this team, I don't know if they're going to go on a cup run their first year, as well as Thatcher Demko, obviously coming off injury. He's going to get back next week. He's only going to get maybe 1-2 games ramping up. I don't really love that. Him not having as much experience, but him having momentum coming into the playoffs. So I think the Vancouver Canucks have more star power than a Winnipeg Jets, but I don't think that they're in that upper echelon when looking at the Western Conference compared to others. Next up, we have the Edmonton Oilers, and I have them at 10%. They're not my cup pick. I think I've made that apparent this year. I'm not fully falling for the trap yet again, like last year when I fell in love with them before even their win streak at the end. But I still do think they are maybe a notch below the top 3 teams that I have in terms of like Colorado, Dallas, and probably Florida still, even though they've been playing a little bit rough. Honestly, maybe the Rangers in there. But I think the Edmonton Oilers would be like 5th in terms of my overall cup odds. When looking at them, they've been obviously fantastic since that really, really rough start. Since December 1st, they've went 38-12-4, 74%. Next closest is 69% in terms of points percentage. They've been far more of a 5-on-5 team this year when looking at their overall percentage of goals, where it's come from. Last year they were first in terms of getting the overall total percentage of their goals from the power play. This year, they're in the middle of the pack. They're at 13th, as well as in terms of 5-on-5, kind of dominating, especially after Chris Knobloch was hired. They have a 57.8% expected goals percentage. The next closest is the Hurricanes at 55%. So they really dominated. It's going to come down to whether Stuart Skinner can give them even 905, I think they'd get out of the first round, even 910. If they get 910 from him, I think they probably make the Western Conference Finals. They are a very complete team, especially with Evan Bouchard emerging as that number 1 defenseman that I've talked about nonstop in this video, as well as having Ekholm playing some of the best hockey his entire career. He is that number 2 that gives you 22, 23 minutes a night of just fantastic two-way play. With them, what's going to be massive? Last year, their 2 top dogs, Draisaitl and McDavid, have performed above their regular season even. The last 2 playoff runs, it's going to be the depth scoring. And I'm not even talking about the bottom 6. I'm talking about Kane, RNH, and Hyman. When looking at them against Vegas last year, the 3 of them combined for 2 goals in 6 games against the Vegas Golden Knights. Massive reason why they lost in 6 games. They're going to need those guys to pick it up. If Hyman doesn't want to get absolutely clowned on for being a 50-goal scorer that goes ghost in the playoffs, I think they're definitely going to have to step it up if they can get some scoring. And not even getting, like, I think their bottom 6 is better, but they just need their other guys besides their top 2 within their top 6 in order to step up. I think I am still nervous about Darnell Nurse, Cody Ceci being in their defense core, but I think considering Evan Bouchard has taken that next step, has taken some of the workload off of Darnell Nurse or even a Cody Ceci, who's basically a bottom pair guy at this point, I think they're going to be fine defensively. I think there's just a narrative that the Oilers have a bad defense core when that really hasn't been the case this season. So when looking at Edmonton, goaltending and their 3rd through 6th best player actually showing up, I think that's the key for them going into it. And again, last year you can shit on them for getting out in the second round. And again, they made me look like a fool, but they did give Vegas by far the closest series out of anybody last year. When looking at the Dallas series, Dallas was down 3-0. Then they eventually got to 6 games and then lost. The Oilers did give the Knights their hardest series out of anybody. And I think if they can get goaltending, they didn't get goaltending when they played the Vegas Golden Knights. If they can get goaltending this time around, they're going to have a decent chance to win the Stanley Cup. So that's it. Leafs 4%, Jets 6%, Canucks 8%, Edmonton 10%. I didn't want to get like cute with it and be like 4.3, 6.1, 7. I just rounded it up. I think that's about fair. Let me know in the comments. What do you think about this? Who am I too low on? Who am I too high on? And who is your pick out of any Canadian team? Who do you think is just going to win who's going to be the next Canadian team, period? Not this season. Who going forward? Do you think the Montreal Canadiens are going to perfect their rebuild? Do you think the Ottawa Senators rebuild is ever going to end? Do you think the Flames in 5 years after their rebuild happens? Who do you think the next Canadian Cup winner is going to be? I want to hear from you guys, and I'll be seeing the next one.